Well, they're
We're
working.
live, Madam Chair.
Welcome back. This is House Corrections and Institutions Committee. It is Wednesday, January 10th, and we're back a little late for our 1 o'clock meeting. We're just trying to get settled in. We are missing a couple committee members. Two are working on some issues together, and Connor is with his group from Ireland. So we're missing some committee members. But we have with us today the whole cadre of corrections. We got new faces, we got old faces, and we even have some folks on Zoom, I believe, too. For that, we have VSCA here, we have BGS here. So maybe as we start, this is our first meeting of the session with the Commissioner of Corrections, and it's a real time for updates in terms of what's occurred in corrections over the summer and fall, and also a time for questions that we have. I just want to give the Commissioner heads up. We spent time last week as a committee to go over some of the issues that committee members would be interested in looking at. And of course, there were issues from corrections that popped up. There were issues around talking about out-of-state beds. There were issues talking about providing mental health services while someone's incarcerated. Issues about training and retention of correctional officers, talking about segregation, did I already mention that? So there's a whole list of items. So we're going to pick, check those off as we go along, and they may develop into bigger issues. We also, as you well know, last week you were out of town, but Annie Remiciano testified before a joint meeting with the House Healthcare Committee, and our committee really trying to get an understanding of how healthcare services are delivered in our incarcerated setting. We want to do here, Representative Houghton and I are going to spend some time, hoping this week, to really figure out what's the next step. Do we have another joint meeting? What are some of the issues that percolated up? And one thing that I would like our committee to spend time on separately from healthcare is really talking about the 1115 waiver. I'd like to schedule some of that next week. I don't know quite who to have in for that, but to really talk about what the process is when someone is hospitalized, what is available or not available for health insurance, and then what is the process right now for when someone is due to reenter the community, what the process is there, and then talk about the 1115 waiver in general, get into more depth about that particular piece. But we're hoping to schedule that next week.
Okay.
So we may need some help in terms of who to bring in. Another issue that percolated up, the committee members were interested, was the work crew, doing away with the work crews. There is a bill that was just introduced that went to judiciary that does establish community restitution sentencing alternatives, and it has the commissioner of DOC adopting rules to put something like this in place. I'm going to reach out to the chair of judiciary to really see if we can do some work on that bill, because it's in our jurisdiction as well. So those are some of the issues percolating out there. So with that being said, just will now turn it over to you, Commissioner, to kind of give us an overview of what's occurred in the last few months and open it up for questions from the committee.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see you all again. I'm back in our nice cozy quarters here. My name is Nick Demmel. I'm the Commissioner of the Vermont Department of Corrections, and excited to share some of what we thought the highlights were from the last year since we last met, and then also to make sure we entertain any of the topics that are of high importance or interest to you today. Great. Isaac's got the deck up here. So since the last session, you may remember we currently have 4 major priority areas that we are trying to focus on. The staff and staffing issues in our system. So that's our people, and also how we staff the system itself. the health and wellness of both our population that we're serving and our staff, diversity, equity, inclusion, and ensuring that the Department of Corrections is a just system, and then modernization. And we mean that in the fullest sense of the word, modernizing our infrastructure, modernizing our data systems, modernizing our practices to be the best in the nation and the most modern, evidence-based that we can, and trying to be really innovative in that space. So we broke down some of the highlights here into those different categories, and we'll go through each one of those. And then as we go, please feel free to stop and highlight or ask questions about anything that you find of particular interest. So to start, we'll look just briefly at the demographics, where we're at population-wise. This hasn't changed significantly since we met last summer, late spring. We have just over 1,300 individuals incarcerated in Vermont. The breakdowns remain roughly the same as they were at that time.
Are you sending a copy to Phil?
Sure.
Yes, it's all posted.
They are posted.
I'll get it later, but
Yes, good.
thank you. So when you say that there's 1,300 incarcerated, that does not include the out-of-state in Mississippi?
It does, yeah. So in Vermont, the number's in the 1,200s for in-state, and then we have 126 individuals out of state. The detained number, so you'll remember Vermont is a unified system. We have both detained, so pre-sentence individuals and sentenced individuals. That detained population, pre-sentence, has also remained relatively steady over 2023. We saw, obviously during the pandemic, that number decreased. In 2022, we saw a little up there, and then in 2023, it remained relatively steady. And then I'll highlight just who do we have in our system, or why are they in our system? 93% of the individuals that are detained are there for a felony charge. 95% of the sentenced population is there for a felony charge. Many of those are violent crimes. 78% of our sentenced population is there for a violent crime. And only 3.8% of our population are detained or sentenced for some type of drug offense. Yes, sir.
So back on the detained, the federal holds, they're not there only for what? So is that like a running average or?
So that's a point in time look.
They're just passed through 2 days there, right?
Well, if we're talking about individuals who are facing a federal criminal charge in the state of Vermont, those individuals tend to be with us longer on average, much like our own detained population. And then there's a subset of federal holds that are ICE detainees. Those individuals are only with us for about up to 48 hours. And that 61 number remains relatively steady because it's in part governed by a contract between the state and the federal government.
And that's not reflected, is that reflected in, oh, it is, okay. So 471 are total detained,
Correct.
male and female.
Yep.
61 of those are federal.
That's right. And those numbers fluctuate day over day, but this is generally where we've been for quite a while now. Yes, sir.
I just appreciate the removal of other from your transgender category. Thank you.
Yeah, we learn from the input that we receive here. No, and we want to make sure that we highlight the different types of populations we have here too, because I know that there's high interest in that, and individuals in our system have different needs, and we need to be responsive to that. Okay, so moving to our staffing table, I know this has been of high interest, certainly to our department, this committee, I know our friends at VSEA as well. You'll remember in July of 22 is really the high water mark. This reflects June, but those 2 months were largely the same. So we breached the 30% vacancy rate among security staff positions. At that point, we'd worked together on the bargaining side and worked with our labor partners to work on the monetary supports. And then the department came up with what we call our stability and sustainability plan. First, stabilize the systems and then start building for the future and making it a sustainable correction system. The second dotted line on this chart shows you when we implemented that plan. Since that time and through today, we've gotten our vacancy rate down to 16.6% in security staff positions. You'll see a little up there recently, and that's more a reflection of the way we're building our hospital coverage team because we added positions to the security staff that we then had to recruit for. But by and large, we've been in a downward trajectory, and I think that is largely due to the work we did with VSEA and within the department to really reorient ourselves to our people, find ways to invest in them, improve our recruitment techniques. And what we've learned as this process has gone on is fixing the recruitment challenges is the easiest part. Retaining folks once they're on your team is the harder part. But that's also where we're going to make the most headway. And so that's really our focus now is what is it that our staff want? Why are they in our system? How do we encourage them to stay with us for longer? And how do we adjust our system to those people and make sure that they are having fulfilling careers? We know that the trauma, the lived experience of folks incarcerated and our staff often run concurrent to each other. And so if our staff are not doing well, our population is not going to do well. And so there are a variety of reasons that this is some of the most important work that we're doing in the Department of Corrections. One of
I figured some questions on this.
Well, yeah, I didn't see how are you dealing with sort of academy numbers?
Yeah, so the academy numbers are running very hot. So on average, our academies would be about 20 cadets on a given basis. We've had academies in the 60s. We've had academies run pretty steadily at 30 or higher for the last 2 years or so, year and a half. And so the academies we're recruiting folks into the system. What we want to see is, and I don't believe we have the chart in this deck, but we do have another chart that starts to highlight in the last year, we noticed that people were actually showing they were staying longer, and we measure that by months of experience. And so if you looked at 2022 look, you would see that most of our staff had less than 1 year of experience. If you look at the brand new data, it's from 2023, but say you pulled it today, you would start to see that now there's a growing group of people who have greater than a year of experience and a new group who have less than a year of experience. And so that starts to indicate to me that we're having success keeping people longer. Now, we're still talking in terms of months at this point, and we have spent a long time kind of neglecting this issue. And so we've got a lot of ground to make back up, but the early indications are we're starting to have success where we hope to have it.
Michelle?
So you mentioned that the current numbers are 16.6 for security staff. I'm wondering about other staff. Like, what about case managers and volunteer coordinators? Like, is it a similar level?
So case managers would be included in that number.
Okay.
I got to pull out my phone to look at the other numbers, but I can give them to you right off the top of our sheet here. It's significantly lower. We look at security staff because those are the folks, if we do not have them, we cannot run the facility.
Okay.
Versus our central office staff, our field staff, critically important. But those numbers don't directly impact the ability for us to operate a correctional facility.
Although some of them could impact programming and things like that.
Definitely.
You know,
Oh,
I've
absolutely.
seen that in some.
Absolutely. So we think of it as critical operation. That's like keeping the lights on, keeping the door shut. Then we start thinking about, okay, now what are our service deliveries? Programming would be one, education would be another. So today, central office vacancy rate is at 11.9% and the field vacancy rate is at 8.3%. So sub 10. And you know, this isn't perfect math. I would say if we could get vacancy rates at or under 10%, that would be success, particularly in the environment we're operating in right now.
Jeff?
So being on security staff or
Yes.
correctional officer is a difficult job.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea what the profile of an applicant looks like? Who are you seeing applying for these jobs? Do you have an idea of that, Commissioner?
We do. I mean, it's varied, I'll tell you. I mean, I think I would have said, coming into this job, if you asked me that question, what do you expect it to be? I would think it might be more homogenous, that we'd be seeing one profile. And it's actually fairly varied. I mean, I think our academy director just sent us the demographics from the current academy that's running. I don't have those off the top of my head, but we're happy to share those with you. There is a pretty good cross-section of education level, for example. We'll take individuals who have a high school level education and higher, but we are getting folks with some college or college graduates. We have gotten, I've noticed kind of anecdotally in the last few academy classes that have graduated, we're getting mid-career folks, which I think is great that, they bring a body of experience, even if it's not corrections experience, into our system. I think that's good. And we're seeing diversity amongst that group too. Not to the levels that we want yet, but that is certainly something that we're striving for. It's varied. I mean, certainly we're looking for folks who at least have a high school diploma, no felony criminal record by and large, and then can pass our academy, and folks that meet those criteria, it's a fairly varied profile.
It's good to hear. Well, used to be a lot of former military. Have you seen?
Yeah, it's interesting. We don't, I think, have a ton of data on this here in Vermont, but I've been working very closely with the state of Texas on this workforce issue. And the one thing that Texas was sharing was they invested substantial resources into trying to recruit veterans. And the veteran cadets coming out of their academy were the fastest group that left the Department of Corrections in Texas. And so they're studying that to understand what are they not getting here that we would have expected. I think many people would hypothesize that somebody coming from a military organization may be interested in joining what is functionally a paramilitary organization, and the camaraderie and uniforms and et cetera. And that is not proving true in Texas. I'm not saying that's true or not true in Vermont. But I think when you start, we have these notions of what's happening, but when you start digging deeper and really study and use some of the data and do state interviews and look at the conversations that supervisors are having, you start to see that it's not exactly what we think it is, and then it helps us to target down on other folks that we're maybe leaving behind.
Thank you.
I mean, I think if I could just add, one thing that fascinates me is, I spend a lot of time working on the staffing stuff here in Vermont and then with some groups nationally, because this is the correction staffing problem is a national crisis. One of the things about the demographic data in Vermont is, there are fewer and fewer workers in the workforce. Many folks are leaving the workforce, and those folks kind of late in their career are probably not great candidates for a CO1 position in a facility anyway. The demographic that's growing the largest that is available to work is women in the state of Vermont. They're going to make up a majority of the workforce in a short order. And correctional facilities, correctional systems have historically not been very good at recruiting and retaining women in the system. Vermont is actually one of the better ones. We have over 30% of our staff are women. That's not where we want it to be, but if the workforce is going to be 60% women, maybe that's a demographic that we need to target and figure out how do we recruit these individuals into our system? How do we keep them for longer? And I think that'd be very healthy for our system as well.
Tristan?
You're negotiating a new labor contract currently?
Yes.
How's it going?
So good. We can't talk much about that because that process is ongoing.
Well, you probably can't comment much on this, but I'll just put it out there. Is there any concern of, the side letter was effective at improving this situation? How do we feel about going into an agreement and keeping some of the, there's certainly people you encounter that are sticking around longer and ready to retire pretty soon. Are you concerned about sort of a drop off?
Yeah, we had a meeting about this yesterday with the state of Massachusetts, to talk about some of this workforce stuff. And one of the things our data chief was sharing with them is, because they asked, do you think you're going to have, or have you seen a huge drop off of retirements, people terminating for retirement? And we really haven't over the last couple, that number hasn't really changed much. And there's, I think, two things that I would point to as to why that's happening, and then there's probably some other reasons. One, the state changed its pension system for correctional officers. And so we did see folks leave before that happened. And we also saw a lot of folks retire during the pandemic. And so my hypothesis on this is many of the folks who are kind of on the cusp or wanting to move to that next chapter in life probably have already done that. And now we're in our kind of normal retirement attrition. I don't know if that's true, but that's our kind of operating theory.
Great.
So I have a question about folks who are coming in to be correctional officers.
Yeah.
That may have a background in working human services or social worker, working with families, working in the mental health field, and they feel that they can bring this into their job as a correctional officer, because many of the folks who are incarcerated may be part of these other systems that we offer, and to bring that ability as a correctional officer to supervising of folks.
Yeah.
How do you know how, when that situation occurs and someone is now went through the training and is now employed in a facility, how the veteran correctional officers are reacting to that person that's now coming in and wanting to provide more social services or more support to an inmate, and maybe some correctional officers who have been there for a long time, it's new to them, a new focus in terms of how to deal in the workplace. How does that get played out in the facility? How is that handled? Are they welcoming, are both sides welcoming of each other in terms of the different approach, or are there some issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think for a long time, we've had quite a bit of success recruiting folks with kind of social services backgrounds or skills into our probation and parole offices as, supervising individuals in our community. And I think that's great. It's one of the two primary pipelines to become a probation and parole officer. You either come from the facilities, the correctional facilities, as you kind of promote and move to the field, or you're hired from the outside, and often those folks did have some type of social services background. I think that adds a lot of value to our system. I mean, at the end of the day, corrections is a human service. That's why in Vermont we're housed in the Agency of Human Services. We are providing human services to individuals, and often many human services all at once. And I think there's been a change in the theory, the philosophy behind corrections in the United States, certainly in Vermont, over the last 20, 30 years, that if we don't take care of the folks, they're not going to leave and be successful in our community. They're going to come right back. And so one of the primary tools to break that cycle of recidivism is to really help them with their human needs, in addition to whatever the state determines as kind of the punishment or the term of incarceration. I think we are starting to now make pretty good headway into recruiting folks with social services, backgrounds, or skills into our correctional facilities as correctional officers. And there's certainly generational gaps that exist in our system. I think I shared this with you last year. Missouri, and then I just saw this week a slide from Texas, has a chart of their staff, and their staff are less than 1 year of experience and more than 20 years of experience, and there's nothing in between. Like, they would just all those folks are gone. They've left the system for a variety of reasons. And I think largely because we've neglected the staffing issue. We've neglected that investment in the people and changing our systems to be adaptive to that. And so if you have a system like that, where you have brand new folks and very senior folks who are often generationally also, very different, there's a tension that exists there, and we want to flatten that out, because I think that even our folks who've been in the system from the beginning of their career, 30, 35, 40 years ago, still have a vested interest. They want to see folks improve, be successful when they leave the system, get them out of the system, not see them again. That's a common refrain. Like, I don't want to ever see you again. And that's a good thing in our system. But sometimes the ways we do that are a little different, and some of that's generational. But for most corrections officers, they're going to be on the younger, and I mean in years of seniority, the younger side of the spectrum. And I think there is just a mindset towards social services and human services and recognizing the human dignity in the people that they're serving. And I think our staff do a remarkable job of treating people with dignity and respect and finding ways to help them through. And I think our system isn't quite there yet. We need to continue to change our processes. The physical infrastructure of the building also speaks to this. All of those things help us to create an environment where we can deliver those services to people.
Because I just wonder in terms of the culture within a correctional facility, and I'm sure it's different between facilities, but there must be some tension there between your veteran correctional officers and new ones who are coming in, just in terms of attitude of how you supervise. And I'm just wondering, if there's a difference there with the newer folks coming in really wanting to help the inmate, and that's being perceived as you're coddling the inmates, you're playing, I don't want to say favoritism, but you're an inmate lover.
Yeah.
That kind of thing, and you want to, give them everything that they want, and we don't want to do that.
Yeah. And one of the...
That must be occurring.
It does, certainly. I won't dispute that. I mean, one of the ways that we've reoriented folks or exposed them to kind of the modern way of doing things through our training in our academy, which does speak a lot about the human need. It's very, a predominant amount of the training is focused on communication and that type of work. We've introduced motivational interviewing as our primary technique for our field folks for community supervision. The other thing about those models, though, are they're successful. Just punishing isn't successful. The data does not support that. But it does support making human connections, building rapport, communicating, treating underlying issues. Those are the ways that we help people move through these systems and ultimately, hopefully, are successful then in the outcome.
John?
You graduate from the academy, you just go to work at one of the facilities, and you get some time in. At what point do you start additional training as they step up the ladder?
So we have a 6-week academy. That's the initial period of training for folks. And then there's annual, we call them core competency trainings that continue to keep folks' skills fresh and up to date. And then there's a slew of other training that exists. You can promote from a CO1 to a CO2, which is kind of the first step up the ladder. And then from there, shift supervisor, there's caseworkers, and each of those different positions have different skills and training that accompany some of that. But one of the things we're working on, because we noticed it was a pain point in our system, and we know this from other systems around the country, is one of the most important roles in a correction system is the first line supervisor. I think that's true in most workplaces, but it's critically important in corrections. And we weren't training those folks as well as we should have been. And so we've worked over the last couple of years to really redesign that training and get focused on if those first line supervisors are knocking it out of the park, then the folks that work for them, the CO1s, the CO2s, they're going to knock it out of the park too, because they got leaders and mentors and trainers they can believe in. So I think that's one of the most critical pieces of training.
Explain the promotional system. Is it merit and testing, or how do you step up?
Yeah, it's an application process. So if there's if your CO1 and a CO2 slot opens, they'll advertise that for the facility or the system, and somebody applies. They go through interviews. It's generally a process for each position up the ladder.
Tristan, and then we're going to move on.
Okay.
We've got more things going on.
You encouraged us to ask questions.
I know. Then I'm at fault.
I was told there were no questions.
But not so not so much.
I did want to ask specifically caseworkers. Do you have a vacancy rate for that?
I don't. I don't know. Travis, if you know off the top of your head.
It's really uncommon. It's a smaller subset within the facility. It's one of the kind of preferred lanes of growth when you're, you know, if you like facility work, but you want to kind of do a little bit more. So pretty sought after. I don't have the numbers back, but we could get that.
I mean, the majority of our vacancies are CO1 positions, and then CO2 would probably be second.
So your staff adequate for case working essentially?
I believe so. I mean, I think there's a debate about the casework system and whether that is robust enough, but for the allotted positions we have, to Travis's point, we don't often see vacancies there. When we do, they're filled quite quickly because it's one of the better jobs in a facility, I think.
Well, I'd love to come back to that point of debate, but maybe we should go on to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll go through this next slide fairly quickly. One of the major pain points I think you heard about last year was that the field was having to cover hospital coverage for individuals who are incarcerated but had to go to a hospital because they needed a higher level of care. That was a huge drag. Field had been for, at that point, a few years, started kind of during the pandemic, and we could never get off of it. There are a lot of driving forces for that. One, it's the facility staffing was a huge problem. But also we've seen a massive increase in the number of people needing to go to the hospital. So we're talking 30% increase in ER visits, very high level number of visits that are going out there. And that I think is reflected in the health demographics of the population we're serving. As those become more dire, we're seeing more need for outside hospital visits and care and specialty treatment. So a variety of solutions were proposed. We went through a lot of different models to see what would work and what wouldn't work. And one of the tools that we're using now is a dedicated hospital coverage team. And so these are security staff positions. They're technically central office positions, but they don't work out of central office. Their job is to cover the hospitals. And so when an individual first goes to a hospital from a facility, they're taken by facility staff. But when that person's admitted after a certain period of time, then this team takes over that coverage and stays with that individual until they're brought back to a facility or released or whatever happens. It's not perfect. It's not covering everything, but it has dramatically changed the way we're doing hospital coverage in the state, and it has allowed us to essentially draw down the need for field resources in this space. And so now we have a system where the hospital coverage team is the first to cover. If the whole team is exhausted, is being used, then we go to a volunteer list that we have to cover any available slots. If that doesn't work, the facilities can cover some, and the last option then is the field. And so this just launched about Thanksgiving timeframe. Since that time, we've alleviated 443 shifts that would have been covered by the field. We've saved almost 2,000 field hours of overtime. And it seems to be a watershed moment for us, and is really, it's not entirely solved that problem. We continue to look at how we can eliminate the need for field coverage, but it is essentially made this problem much, much smaller.
So St. Albans, the hospital in St. Albans, was the emergency room, was so clogged up. They increased that by and put in a couple of rooms that could be used for those people. Have you got feedback on that? Has that eased up that problem that was in St. Albans?
I haven't gotten feedback on that. I did meet with the president of the hospital in St. Albans in the late fall, I forget the time frame, and we talked about, kind of the clogged system. And that's not St. Albans, that's everywhere in the state of Vermont and New Hampshire, because we often use Dartmouth Hitchcock. I hope that helps. I mean, our goal is to try not to send people to the ER when it's unnecessary and get them admitted or moved on as quickly as we can. But the hospital backlogs are really shocking. And folks who are in the ER because they need a different placement, but nothing's available. And so you can see how this cascades and builds and builds. And, we've got 1,300 folks incarcerated in the state of Vermont. Many of them have pretty complicated medical issues. And so we're a large user of hospital systems around the state. So we definitely contribute to that. We're trying to work very hard with our hospital partners to not be a burden and find ways to work together and massage that out. And I think one of the virtues of having a dedicated team that does the hospitals is they can build those relationships with UVA Medical Center, with Dartmouth, with St. Albans or Newport. And I think that'll really help. And so everybody's on the same sheet of music when they're doing this work.
So I just want to clarify, so if a person needs to be taken to a hospital for an EKG or update on their cancer treatment, or they're going in for infusion, but they're not admitted, it's going to be the facility staff that goes to folks that go with the person.
It varies, but yes, most of the time, vast majority of the time, it would be a facility that would manage that.
If someone is then admitted, then that shifts to folks more from central office arena
Yeah,
working.
they're aligned to the central office, but they're not
They're
working.
not physically working in the central office, but they're aligned from that. They're not coming from the facility as either correctional officers or the PMP office.
Right, we have a dedicated team of corrections officers.
Sheriff's taking people to the hospital.
No,
Not for corrections.
not for corrections, no. That's done all correctional vehicles and correctional staff.
Yeah.
Yeah. When there's an ambulance that comes in and they have to transport someone to that local emergency room, are there officers, correctional officers that go with that ambulance, or they go in, do they also?
Yeah, they go, and or we have a trail car too that can go. I mean,
We'll have
there's-
one officer in the vehicle, or sometimes in the helicopter, although sometimes you have to put on a scale to make sure they can. Fly the helicopter.
and it
Taking me for example.
It becomes more complicated when they're a federal detainee because the federal law requires that our officers are armed for those transports, which we found out a year or so ago that they don't let guns in helicopters. So we had to work through that problem. But also in that circumstance, there'd have to be armed officers in the ambulance with the detainee.
How many of our federal detainees do need hospital care? Is it?
Many. I mean, I think my guess, I don't know exactly, but that trend's very similar to our own population.
Since we've been really looking at it with the hospital coverage too, we've had at least a couple of our federal detainees that are acutely ill. And with the nature of those illnesses, they might be in the hospital for several weeks and then go back for a few weeks, and then whatever their ailment is resurges and back to the hospital to go.
So then that leads, this is a two-pronged question. If it's a person who's incarcerated under our own state system and they're transported by the local EMTs, ambulance, or even the helicopter, are we paying for that transport? Vermont?
I think that the transport is covered by Medicaid, but I could be mistaken. If it's an emergency room transport, so basically, in broad strokes, if an individual is receiving care in our correctional system, the health contract that we have pays for that care. So that's
That health contract we have is funded through our general fund.
correct. Yep.
So it's Vermont tax dollars that are paying for that transport.
Well,
not.
I'm saying if somebody is in, so say they're in Springfield correctional facility, they are getting treated in the infirmary. That's paid for by the contract. When that individual leaves Springfield and goes to a hospital, that care becomes Medicaid billable.
A hospital care or the transport?
I think both. We'll confirm the transport question, but definitely hospital level of care is an eligible Medicaid.
If they're admitted or if they're just worked through in the ER and then released?
I think it's care that is provided outside of a correctional system because we don't have that level of care available. I think that's the question that is asked in the billing structure.
So if the person is, when they're incarcerated, their insurance and Medicare, Medicaid go away, and electronically within DEVA, that administers all the Medicaid, they're canceled out of Medicaid.
Right. I think
They're
it's
not paused, they're canceled.
the state is essentially billing Medicaid for that, not the individual.
Not the individual.
And this goes back to the incarcerated exclusion provision in Medicaid that was written in the 60s.
Dr. Christie.
Oh, I know, but you know what the issue is? Well, we'll talk offline on that. And we'll talk to the commission on it.
This is really
Because there's
encouraging.
history there for that.
It's really encouraging, Commissioner. I know there's a real pain point
Yeah.
for the staff and facilities, and congrats on coming up with a new solution.
Yeah, Travis and his team are largely the architects of this, and it was some trial and error, but and it's not perfect. But neither's Travis. So this is Travis Denton. He is our facilities director, so he's in charge of the 6 correctional facilities and all the staff and individuals who live and work there.
Tough job.
Very tough. Yeah, third toughest job in the state of Brooklyn.
Anything else? We're going to be doing a lot of deeper dives in terms of healthcare and how it's provided within our incarcerative setting. And also situations such as hospital admissions and also situations of reentry into the community and that smooth transition back to the community.
Yeah, so the next section, a couple of slides, speaks to our substance use disorders, how we're working through that and what we're experiencing. I'll highlight again, I know you've heard this data before, about 60% of our population that we're serving has an opioid use disorder, including other types of substance misuse. We know that number would be far higher, probably close to 90%. The drug supply that we're experiencing, the drugs that folks are using and then presenting to our system with are becoming increasingly dangerous, increasingly complicated. Vermont has dealt with the opioid use issue now for a while, but now it's being mixed with stimulants, which make treating it much more complicated, and we don't have the same system in play. We've built a system for opioids, but now they're mixing with stimulants and that's treated differently. We don't have as much of that. It's a highly complicated, very scary, very dangerous situation. And I can tell you, the folks, we get detainers who get arrested and brought to our system. The condition they are in when they are presenting to our system today is terrifying. Folks are going through severe withdrawal, severe detox, many complicated co-occurring medical issues on top of their substance use issues. And it's difficult to keep up. And I know this is the experience of our hospital partners because we talked to them about this. I know it's the experience of the Department of Health as they monitor this, and law enforcement on the streets seeing this exact same problem. So this is a big focus of ours, is trying to really maximize our substance use treatment options and helping the individuals who do have these conditions when they're in our system. You know that Vermont has a medically assisted treatment program that was the second in the country after Rhode Island, now about 5 or 6 years into that system. And it definitely has flaws and it needs work. And it's onerous on our staff. It's very difficult. Individuals regularly try to divert their medication, which is a security issue, also a health issue. So there's definitely work to be done on that. But we also know that for individuals who are on our MAT program, within 45 days of release from a correctional facility, 70% of them are accessing Medicaid to cover substance use treatment, specifically opioid use treatment. So in my opinion, that's a pretty high rate of success that we are within 45 days, we're connecting folks and they're getting access to that same treatment out on the streets. And we know that that's not enough, and there's a lot more to do here. So we have partnerships with the community recovery centers. There's community recovery centers in all of the jurisdictions where we have a correctional facility, and we have close relationships with them. And we're also working on building out, scaling out of a highly successful initiative that we started at Marble Valley in Rutland, where we partnered with the Turning Point Center to provide peer recovery coaching inside the correctional facility. So these are individuals with lived experience who are trained peer recovery counselors. They come into our correctional system, meet with individuals on our MAT program, build those relationships, help them through their recovery journey. And then when those individuals leave the prison system and go out on the streets, those same coaches, mentors, counselors are the same people in the community that they work with. And we know that connection is critical to their success. So we saw huge success in this program at Marble Valley. We've subsequently launched it at Springfield, and it's in a very nascent stage in South Burlington at the women's facility. And our goal is to try to scale this across our system this year. And we think that it would be a huge step forward for our system if we were able to do this.
Mary?
So you said you had a huge success in Rutland. If Representative McGuire was here, would he be agreeing with that? Have you?
I hope so. I know he works closely with the Turning Point Center. I think he's on the board of the Turning
No,
Point.
and I know he is. That's why I asked the question.
Yeah. And I think, Springfield was a natural next step in part because they had some of that infrastructure there. Turning Point was operating there, but also because that's a very vulnerable facility for the individuals there. The women's facility, critically important, also in Chittenden County, which is a hotbed for some of this activity. And so we hope to scale this system wide. This is done in other jurisdictions outside of Vermont, and the evidence is very promising that this is really can be a key to helping people succeed in recovery.
Can you just want to understand more specifically what this means? So if I'm incarcerated and I want, I'm having a hard day and thinking of using some drugs that I shouldn't use or I don't want to use, can I get access to someone in the facility that same day to talk to and get support?
Yeah, that's a good question. So they have organized groups and meetings that they do on a regular basis. I don't know if it's on.
Usually in Rutland, I think they come in 3 days a week. There's a peer coach there who they meet with. And there's sort of two modalities. There's like a group smart recovery model, and then there's also one-on-one individualized coaching. So I'm hoping, Chair, at some point in the next few weeks, we can actually have the Turning Point directors from both Rutland and Springfield come in and talk to you more about this program and how they hope to see it scale across the state. And just one more note, we did present to the Opioid Settlement Advisory Committee for funding for this because I think it's important to note that we're asking our community partners to take on an entire new caseload, and the Turning Point and Turning Point equivalent centers will tell you that they are already pretty strapped in terms of resources. So we will be in this building talking to you all about what you can do on the funding end to help support this, because this program is going to require investment.
So you have recovery coaches going into the facility to work with the incarcerated population, but also I think the goal is also some of the folks who are incarcerated could become recovery coaches.
Oh, absolutely.
And then that's what would help within the
I
facility.
mean, it's a virtuous cycle in so many different ways. It's also, hey, when you get out, I can help you get a job. I can help you find housing. All these other pieces, because they have a human connection to somebody on the outside, but also somebody who's experienced what they've experienced and is well-versed in this work. So we're really excited about this. It is, costly, but when we think of the lives we can save through programs like this and also, helping people really stay on that recovery pathway, I mean, this seems like a good investment of our time and energy.
And this is a way to contribute to public safety back in the community, as well as looking at the recidivism rate too for DOC. So it's multifaceted.
I mean, I think it's worth highlighting. I showed you the data at the beginning. 60% of our population has an opioid use disorder, but only 3.8% of people are in prison because of drugs. Kind of. They're not being incarcerated because of drug charges, but we know that substance use is involved in the cycle of committing crime. People are, surviving however they can. And so if we can help them through that, I think we can, it's critical that we do this work. So moving forward then, one of the other great initiatives that we've gotten off the ground really since we met last, because it launched over the summer, is the partnership with the Community College of Vermont. So we received a nearly $5 million federal earmark to provide free community college education to any staff member of the Department of Corrections and any incarcerated individual in the Department of Corrections. We launched the staff side first, and staff were able to take classes beginning last summer. And have seen just great results from the staff who have taken it, really enjoy the program. And we continue to see more and more enrollment over the last 2 semesters now.
How many took advantage of it?
I think we had the numbers in here. So we had 34 staff who were enrolled full-time in the course catalog. And then for incarcerated, we have 105 placements and we had 135 applicants. The interesting thing, I don't think we broke it down on here. So we piloted this at the women's facility in South Burlington and at Newport, in part because Newport had already provided college education there prior to the pandemic. But for the population at CRCF, I forget the number. Isaac, do you remember how many students there were?
39.
39. So I'll orient you. We only have about 100 people incarcerated there. So that's 40% of the incarcerated population taking advantage of this in its first pilot, first semester. And so we were really heartened to see that at the women's facility. And so we just hosted Senator Sanders up at Newport. We toured and then visited with one of the classes up there. The reaction from the classroom was, we love this and we need and want more of it. How do we get more? So we're hoping to add a facility every semester now until we get all 6 facilities online. And then we hope we can build out the courses that are available and the different ways that we can get folks to take classes. So right now they're in-person classes in the prisons, but we could get a remote model and an asynchronous model so that there's different modalities that people can take these classes. The data behind providing education in a correctional facility and success in the community is astronomical. And so this was a great offering from the federal government. And we hope that we get to scale pretty quickly, and then we hope that other states can take advantage of it in the future.
Questions?
Does CCV have a class for recovery coaching?
They don't, but that's an interesting, we've talked about using some of CCV for, to augment some of the training. We were talking about that earlier, but yeah, it'd be an interesting idea to talk about recovery coaching.
Yeah, most of the trainings are through DAMR. And we would need to build out a specialized recovery coaching within correctional facilities.
Because they do that with Turning Points.
Yeah.
That's where the training is.
I love the, it's great, and I really appreciate what you said about success of those individuals in the community, and we need to be finding those things. And
there's actually an article in 7 Days that was published today about the education system in Vermont's correctional system, and the proof is there that it succeeds. If people can access education, they are more likely to succeed. And so we need to find all these things that we know help people launch when we get them out of our system. And so we're really trying to hang on to those things and build those out so that people can go out and be successful and not come back.
I guess I'm wondering what's the number limitation in terms of there were 135 applicants and only 105 available placements? Is that like class size is 20 or something?
Yeah, it's class size. It was instructor, the available number of instructors, because this is all just starting. So we, what we did was CCV and DOC got together and created a center that is jointly staffed. So DOC staff, CCV staff, and started designing the programming. Then we had to recruit faculty. And so we were piloting, kind of test running it at Newport. That's what you're seeing there, 105 available slots. And then the goal, now that we are working through the kinks, figuring out what works, what doesn't, getting technology in, that was another huge barrier, is we had to redesign our IT infrastructure for education so that they had the right computers, tablets, that they had a certain closed off internet system. And then the goal is to really expand so that
When will the other facilities have access to these?
Yep, so we're trying to add 1 facility per semester.
Yeah.
So that we can do it and make sure it's successful and we're not overcommitting ourselves.
So when does Springfield start, for example?
I don't know if you guys know what semester Springfield is lined up
Just
for.
started Northwest.
Yeah, so Northwest is the one we added now. So now it'll be South Burlington, Newport, and Northwest.
Will the 4.5 million cover the start of all of those, or will you need more federal funding?
So that provides us about 5 years or so of funding. But the federal government also just changed its Pell Grant eligibility to allow incarcerated individuals to use Pell Grants to pay for college education. So that will continue to serve as the funding stream so that they can pay for the classes on that side. There will be probably ultimately some additional funding needs, but I think there are other mechanisms that we're pursuing to fulfill those needs.
We have a lot of questions. John, Wayne, and Troy.
Okay.
One metric of the people that are taking advantage of this system, are we preparing them for GED or are they going right into college level courses?
So these are college level courses. We do provide a high school diploma equivalent in the correctional system. So folks can take advantage of that already. And then this is for individuals who would want higher education. So they could pursue a degree. That is an option. They can also pursue certificate programs. I suspect that many of the individuals will take advantage of the program to targeted skills that they can then use to connect to outside employment.
Yeah, you have to have completed the high school program before you can get into it?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, you don't have to complete our high school program, but you have to have had a
GED or
GED.
diploma. Okay.
Yep. And that's true of any CCV student.
Troy?
Do you happen to know if there was any eligibility constraints on the Pell Grant? Meaning, are there certain sentences that are not eligible?
I think so. This is a law that was in place for a long time and then stopped for a decade or more. And the Biden administration has passed a law to reignite. And so it's called Second Chance Pell. And it's specifically targeted to incarcerated individuals. I believe so, yeah. I don't think there's any restriction on who or type of offense.
Can you talk a little bit about how you made decisions in the delta between 105 and 135? 105 placement.
Oh, the applicants?
Yeah.
I can't, but the CCV, we call it SEPSI, it's the correction, I'm really bad with acronyms.
Correctional education folks.
That staff could go through and explain the criteria and how it's determined, yeah. Okay. One of the things we ended in the last year is our work crew program. And I know that's been of high interest to folks in this room and others. I think there's a couple of things to call out here. Work crew is not being utilized. That's not why we got rid of it, but it was a contributing factor. State's attorneys were not sending people to the work crew program. And part of that was the pandemic, certainly, but there was not we did not see an uptick after the pandemic. The reason, ultimately, there's a couple of reasons why we got rid of work crew. The Council of State Governments Justice Center, who provides Vermont with a robust amount of data on its system and has advised the state, the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, for example, on how to improve its justice system, highlighted to us that the leading cause of incarceration for technical violations was because of work crew failures. We noticed that 2/3 of the folks who were sentenced to work crew were not succeeding and were being reincarcerated. There are 190 active arrest warrants for people for failing to be on work crew. They were serving less than 2% of our supervised population. And if we were to keep the program going this year, it would have cost us nearly $4 million. So the combination of those factors, the fact that it candidly doesn't work, that people were going back to prison, even though this was supposed to be the program to help them stay out of prison, and that it was going to cost the state a robust amount of money and staff hours to facilitate a program that was only serving 2% of our supervised population, led us to the conclusion that our time, energy, money can be better spent somewhere else in programs that actually work and serve the needs of the supervised population. And so I know this is controversial because work crew has been around in the state for a long time, and it has been around in the justice system outside of Vermont for a long time. But the the data just didn't support its continued existence. One thing to highlight is the people who traditionally qualify for work crew are folks who have substance use issues or alcohol addiction issues. Those also happen to be folks who have a hard time showing up for scheduled appointments and have work that they had to miss. So if one day a week you couldn't go to work because you had to go do work crew, they were losing jobs, destabilizing their lives. And I think those are the things that are feeding folks' inability to be successful in this program. And I think we're open to alternatives that connect people with things that we think will help them on their supervision journey. The work crew program was not it. And so I know that this is of interest to the legislature this year. This is the department's thoughts on why this is not the program to pursue, and that we would certainly be open to discussing other types of opportunities. But reinstating the program that existed really, I think, is not good for the people that we're trying to serve.
So what we heard back from some state's attorneys was that it's a tool in the toolbox. May not be used a lot, but at least it's a tool there that could be used. And it's just taking away a tool.
So the predicate of the program is something called pre-approved furlough. I think there's one other word in there. Again, I'm showing my inability to remember acronyms.
Pre-approved.
We can use pre-approved furlough as a structure to do other things. So we could use that as a tool to help people connect with treatment, and failure of treatment might result in a sanction. Or we talked about using RCCB opportunity or connection there for education or community service or work. We know there are a couple of predicates to success when somebody is on supervision. They need a place to live, they need money to survive, and that some people need substance use treatment. Those are really kind of the three predicates to people. You know, if you don't have those, it's highly unlikely you're going to be successful. So how do we service those? Well, let's target those things and try to help people on those fronts so that they can go above and beyond and really be successful out there. Cleaning the Fish and Wildlife site or mowing a cemetery lawn, while those are community services and those have been valuable to our communities, those aren't rehabilitative. Those aren't helpful in connecting people or working them through this journey. And when this program was designed, the population it was serving is very different than the population that we are working with today. Largely folks on work crew would be a DUI case or something similar. Those folks aren't in this system anymore. Now we're dealing with folks with severe substance use issues, alcohol dependency, but beyond a DUI, I mean, very severe alcohol dependency, and other, crimes of that nature. And so it just didn't fit with our values as a department as we've articulated them. The data didn't support it. The costs were astronomical. And so that's the reason why. And I'll pause there if folks have questions.
Wayne?
So we have good communication with the district attorney. So somebody's pushing on it. District attorneys communicated this kind of.
Yeah, we have met with them. We have a philosophical disagreement on this front, but we have presented the data to them. We've talked to them, and I certainly understand the position that they're in, where they are trying to find ways to resolve cases, particularly with the backlog the state's experiencing. They're trying to find, they don't necessarily want to incarcerate folks either, and so they try to find alternatives. But again, when we start to peel the layers of the onion back, what is happening isn't actually what we are hoping will happen. And so our goal is to try to find other avenues. So we have explored other options with them. We don't have a set way forward yet, but it is a work in progress.
You have thought of and articulated to them some possibilities.
Yeah, and I think it starts with the pre-approved furlough structure as a way to do that. And then we've talked about treatment, education, community service, employment as other, let's use those as our, here's what you need to achieve, because we also know that's helping them on their supervision.
Michelle and then Mary?
I was just going to say, you had mentioned earlier in your testimony today that relationships were really important in terms of people's recovery and preparing to work on the outside. And I think if you apply some of those same principles to programs like Work Crew before you get into the system, if you tried to build a more intentional program where it isn't just you're showing up to mow a lawn or you're showing up to do a particular project, but you have a more intensive work group that you're working with that includes some supportive, circle process where people are interacting and understanding each other and working with the supervisors, I think you could have some of the same successes that you end up having, say, with the COSAs, where there's this intensive support that's built between people in the program. And if you combine that with a work crew project, but added those more relationship building elements, I think you would be more likely to succeed. So I hope that you're open to thinking about how could this look different and be more effective.
I agree with you, certainly on the first part, that I think is the model for success, is the relationships, a COSA type model, getting folks into supportive structures. I don't know that DOC is the best at that, but I think we could facilitate, we could connect people with those resources and then help, monitor, do our supervision work. On the second part, though, I will push back a little bit because I think the requirement that folks had to take time out of their lives to come do this, and particularly some of the sentences we were seeing were starting to get fairly long, is extraordinarily disruptive. And that's why people weren't doing it. It was because they couldn't go to work and do work crew. It was because they couldn't care for their children and do work crew. It was because most people can't take a day or two a week out of their lives to go dedicate to something else and maintain that cadence of life. And then particularly that's true of folks who have these complex needs.
Although getting incarcerated is a little bit disruptive to your life as well.
Definitely.
But yeah, anyway, I hope we.
But I would say if you thought somebody was eligible for work crew, the alternative should not be incarceration. The alternative should be something else. Because you're already saying they shouldn't be incarcerated. We're comfortable enough with them not being incarcerated. Okay, well then let's connect them with something that is serving their needs. And we can supervise that. But I don't want the alternative to be incarceration. That's not good either. Because that also is much more disruptive, and they're not going to get the support and help that they need there either.
We're going to go to Mary, then I'm going to speed it along because we have to be on the.
So what is your time frame in creating such a program? And also, you can answer that one.
Yeah, so we've proposed some alternatives to the state's attorneys. And that's kind of where we're at in that process. They would need to want to do one of the alternatives, I think, for it to be successful, because we don't want to just set up a structure nobody's using. Essentially, that's what work crew was. I mean, only 2% of our supervised population was in the program. That's a lot of administrative burden and cost for no real outcome. So we're certainly open to that. We're at the table willing to do that. And I know the state's attorneys are interested in that as well. So I don't have a definitive timeline.
Because you're about a half a year or longer out and you don't have that transitional program.
Yeah.
It'll help these folks. That's important.
So when we decided to end work crew, there were 35, maybe 40 folks who were enrolled in the program. So we're not talking about a disruption of service that's impacting a huge group. And of those, I think it's debatable what the success rate of that group would have
But
been.
I'm saying the success of all of your inmates or residents. It's critical that we have those transitional programs.
Definitely, I
So
agree.
that's, I'm saying, needs to be done in a good program sooner than.
Yeah, I hear that message loud and clear.
This issue is not going to go away. I'm sure we're going to be doing more discussions on this.
Yeah, happy to have that conversation. I think having the folks from the Council of State Governments Justice Center come in and talk about this and programs like this, because I think one of the concerns is states set up programs like this as ways to try to help people, and they end up having kind of perverse outcomes. Unfortunately, it's not the intention, but the act, in reality, how it is realized starts to be pretty punitive to the folks that it was trying to avoid that outcome.
Keep moving.
So we're about done. I just wanted to flag a couple of continued challenges that we're having. Obviously, our vacancy rate is still significantly higher than we want it to. And We want to find ways to better retain our staff and build out that team. Costs of that have been very high. On the health and wellness side, I think we covered this at length, but the illness, the presentation of folks with complex needs is very high. Substance use is very high. On the diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice front, this is an area I think we haven't done enough work in over the last 2 years. That I think it's difficult. We don't have a great tool to be able to identify where disparity is happening in our system. So it's difficult for us to then get in and root that out. I mean, I think we could all predict where some of that is happening, but so that's a key area of interest for me. And I think, you know, we've got some challenges, I will say, with the way that courts behind the correctional walls are being run, and the backlog and the impact that that's having on individuals. And then, you know, a couple other big ones. As everybody knows, we have a huge housing difficulty in the state of Vermont. That is true of the corrections department also. We can't find enough transitional housing for the population that we want to put in transitional housing. And folks that are leaving our system can't find housing, which we know is a predicate for their success. We have an old infrastructure, physical infrastructure, and we have an old data infrastructure. And both of those are key areas of our focus going forward. So I'll pause there. I know that we've got folks to talk about beds and how our systems are structured, but I'm happy to take any other questions or any topics that I didn't cover that you're interested in.
I really do want to spend some time on the beds and how in our system, how those are all divided up, because that's going to be so important to understand our out-of-state population. Listen.
Just roughly how many people are incarcerated today who would be going home if they had a home to go to?
E1s.
I knew this number a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if I have, is Josh online?
Josh was.
Josh can probably rattle it off the top of his head. I knew it a few weeks ago, and it's escaping me.
The last time I looked at it, and it's been a minute since I've looked at it as well, but between 40 and 60 generally, and that's a rotating population. You know, as more folks become eligible and other folks find a bed. So it's sort of a static population, but that's where it is. And that's quite a bit down from where we historically. There's been times that number was 100 to 120. And I give an awful lot of credit to our casework staff to be able to work with folks to find housing. Housing, as you all know, is incredibly difficult to find for folks in the community with jobs and without felonies. And the work that caseworkers are putting into working with folks to find housing for folks coming out of jail very often without resources, and I guess several barriers ahead of them is really astounding. And of course, we've also made some structural changes in terms of reducing the number of folks that we require that for as well, which I think has helped keep that number at a historic low.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was pretty high, way down. Well, it was close to 150 at one point. So, John?
How many people do we have that aren't in Mississippi or with us that are in the interstate compact?
I think these guys had that number.
I have that one as well. It's actually in that latter presentation. So we currently have 6 individuals who are out of state for a Vermont sentence, but not in Mississippi. We have a number of other folks, and Isaac has the numbers in the presentation, who are housed in another system because they also have an obligation there. So they have a sentence somewhere else, or they're pending a charge or resolving a charge somewhere else, as well as a Vermont sentence. We have 6 that are solely Vermont sentences that are housed somewhere other than Mississippi, either through the Interstate Compact or with the federal government through the IGA.
And why would they be housed in a out-of-state facility? Is it the security level that's needed and we can't provide that, or?
A number of different, absolutely.
Or are we also taking 6 folks from other states and housing them here?
All of the above. So there's a number of different reasons we might do that. Sometimes the specific notoriety of a case could put someone at danger in our system. And that's pretty rare, and we're able to manage most of those, but occasionally that may be the case. And we might want to place somebody there. I know the committee is aware of the death of somebody recently who was housed there. And when he entered the system in the 80s, that was a case that was had a high degree of notoriety and a high degree of concern within the community. And so that placement made sense. We also occasionally have folks whose needs we simply struggle to meet within our system. There's not many of those, but Vermont maintains one of, if not the safest system in the country. And we have occasionally had some folks who really are determined to act in a way very contrary to that, that might be better served by a higher level of security in a state that deals with that more regularly. I'm trying to think. Those are the big ones. Occasionally we'll have folks where, oh, that was the other one. Sometimes if you'll have a correctional officer or a member of law enforcement in the state of Vermont who ends up committing a crime and getting a sentence, it really may not be safe for them to be housed in our system. We're a very small state. And if someone served in one of those roles for an extended period of time, it really just might not be a case where we feel like we can keep them safe, and it might be appropriate to put them somewhere else. In terms of us also watching 6 people or so from other states, that is correct. Again, we offer a very safe system. So sometimes there are folks who, for whatever reason, have a safety concern in another state, might be better served here in Vermont. And that's usually how that works out. We have this person who has a need, who we think might be better served in your system. And they have somebody who, for instance, left a security threat through or a game that's not present in Vermont, and they might be safe here, whereas they might be very unsafe in a situation where that's a more prevalent group. So it's a very small number of folks, and we continue to keep, we're aware of them. We have a responsibility for them. We keep in touch with them and visit them. But we really feel that that small number of individuals are better served in a different system.
So let's go to the beds in our system and how they're used. I know we've had this presentation in the past, but I think it's always good for a refresher because we think we have a lot of beds that can be used, particularly for general population. And I think it would be good for the committee to get a refresher here in terms of our beds and how they're used. And so we're going to shift gears here and get it up. So if you could introduce yourself for the record.
Happy to, yes. Good afternoon. My name is Travis Denton. I am the Director of the Facilities Division of Vermont Department of Corrections. I've been in that role since May of 2023. So I'm a new face and an old face, I guess. I've been with the department since 1997, doing a lot of various things. A lot of the things that our staff does right from the bottom up, both in the field and the facility side. However, a little bit new to this role. So thankfully, every team needs a Josh, and we have one, thank goodness. So he's going to fill in some of the blanks on some of these questions. This is definitely his wheelhouse, as you just experienced. And I'll do my best to also answer any questions that I can, or make sure that we get those answers for you in a timely way.
Yeah, so let's start the first slide.
Travis, do you want to talk, or do you want me to? I can go.
Josh, go ahead and lead us through it, and I will do a little bit of crowd work if I need to, as it avails itself.
Absolutely. For the record, Joshua Rutherford. I'm a facility operations manager with the department. I'm sorry I'm not able to join you guys in person today, and I hope I get the opportunity later this session. Although I note that it doesn't look like you have a chair for me right now anyway. So one of the questions certainly that comes up is in terms of our bed count and in terms of that out-of-state housing and why that's still necessary. Because at least on paper, it can sometimes look as if, yes, we could simply absorb those folks back. And a big part of what plays into that is that we have two broad types of housing. We have what we call general population beds, and those suit the majority of the folks in our custody the majority of our time. There's some variance in what those look like from facility to facility, but they meet folks who have sort of the normal needs within our system. We also have some other housing, which is generally temporary in nature. We have special mental health housing. Now, a huge percentage of our population has some sort of mental health diagnosis, and we can manage that in general population for most folks. But we certainly have folks who have a more acute or a more serious level of mental health needs. And we have 2 units, and we'll get into that a little bit in one of the later slides, I believe, to serve those needs. We have 3 infirmaries. One in Northern, one in Southern, and one in Chittenden, to meet folks who have a very acute medical need. That's very often temporary housing while somebody gets better, but we do have that. We also have a unit that houses in Springfield that houses predominantly geriatric or older individuals. A lot of mobility issues in that unit. We have booking cells or admission cells when someone first comes into the system. And we have a couple forms of higher security or restrictive housing cells that are available as well. Those are not places where we want folks, where we want folks to be living. They meet a specific need, usually for a short period of time until we get somebody back where they need to be or moving on to sort of their next step. But they're not intended to be permanent housing. And it is really problematic to put folks in those beds if they don't need them. Restricted housing is perhaps the easiest one, but you can imagine how discomforting it would be to somebody to be placed in restrictive housing simply because we're out of general population beds. It could be disrupting to the milieu in a mental health unit to include someone who didn't meet those needs. So our average male population, including out of state at the moment, is 1232. And our male residential beds or general population beds is 950. The goal would be to not exceed 85% of our total capacity. That's the ACA recommendation. And that's to allow for some flexibility in dealing with things. So we currently are in excess of that. And that's why we have for a number of years now, a couple of decades, relied on out-of-state housing to supplement what we have for in-state beds.
So Josh, can I just interrupt you? Because I think this is real, these numbers right there are the crux. So what I have going around in my head from previous testimony throughout our whole system, male and female, we have about 1,600 beds. That's what's rattling around in my brain. And once you start taking out the specialized beds, be it from infirmary, mental health, booking, restrictive housing, SEG, geriatric units, that type of thing, you're really down to almost to the 900 plus beds that are available for general population. Am I off base, or is that pretty honest?
That's about correct. That
997 male.
947 is what I have as of this morning for available general population beds for males.
What was that? You cut out. You cut out a little bit when you gave the number of how many beds are available this morning for general population.
For males, 947.
947. So, but in our system, I think what's really important for committee members to understand, we have around 1,600 beds in our whole system. But there's at least 800 of those beds are specialized. So 700 are specialized beds that can't be used for general population. I want the members to keep that in mind when you're talking about number of beds and how much is available for the general population, that's the ins and outs of people coming and going or long sentences that don't need to be segregation, that don't need to be in an infirmary, that don't need to be in a geriatric unit, and aren't coming through the facility through booking. I think it's really important for us as committee members to understand this. Because you can have a bed number out there, but it doesn't mean those beds are available to every single person who's coming through the door. Tristan.
Can you say, how are we managing it? We're over capacity. Where are the people? Where are we putting them?
Well, so first of all, we have 126 individuals out of state in the Tallahatchie facility. That takes quite a bit off the top. And then, of course, we always have some folks who are in those temporary beds who have that need at this point in time. So some of those folks are being housed in those beds because they have that need right now. In the past, we've relied on some other measures. I know we used to use gymnasiums. My first living unit as a correctional officer was working in a gymnasium with guys on cots. And I think Director Denton probably had a similar experience in Marble Valley. That's just not how we want to house people. It's not good for them. It's not good for us. It makes it hard for our facilities to stay clean. It makes it hard to have even a semblance of privacy. But we do use that out of state. And we have now, at one point, that was in the realm of 700 folks that we have out of state. And we've really pushed that number down, in part because our overall incarcerated population has been dropped. And that's a lot of hard work, certainly by this committee and by the department to reduce our reliance in Vermont on incarceration, especially for folks who aren't likely to hurt other people. But we have about 126 right now in Tallahatchie. We do have our out-of-state team, including one of my peers, another facility operations manager, who go down there on a regular basis. Our casework supervisor, in fact, was slated to fly down there this morning. I hope he didn't get delayed with the weather. I've been down there. Commissioner Demel's been down there. We do keep track of that population. We also maintain a list of volunteers, folks who want to go there. I received a letter yesterday from an individual who said, I don't have a program obligation until 2030. Can you please put me on the list for Mississippi? And so when we're looking to send folks out of state, we start by looking at folks who have said, hey, I'd like to go, and see if they're appropriate, if they meet our other criteria. I know most of the folks down there, when I was down there last December, 2022, not 2023, were pretty clear that they didn't want to return until it was time for them to do so, until they had an in-state obligation. So it's not, I know there's a belief out there that really nobody wants to be there. And that's not the case. I can't say everybody down there is happy to be there any more than anyone in state is happy to be staying with us. But a number of our folks who are in Mississippi have expressed that they prefer that housing.
And just to dial in on a little bit of the smaller scale things, Josh is talking the big picture, but you'll have pockets of releases throughout the system, whether it's through sentencing or through detainees being released, or folks moving into different beds that are designed for programs. Members of our team are constantly looking at the system as one big system, and essentially every week there's transports kind of bouncing around. So to be incarcerated in the state of Vermont, you could find yourself in several different facilities over the time of your incarceration. And we will look to fill those beds or to see where the pain and pressure points are in a facility and see where maybe some of those releases occurred, and kind of, for lack of a better term, almost frack the system for balance and to fill those beds as you have outflow to manage some of those populations.
And then Troy.
That was along the lines of my question. Right. All the specialty beds, understanding that it's fluid, they're flowing all the time. What proportion of them, roughly what kind of number are in those particular kinds of beds that understanding is going to change? Then are there any of those categories particularly needs?
Well, I think some of that, if I'm understanding your question correctly, is some of it is based on the site and how the site operates. So you might say, you know, some of the larger systems might need more seg beds because of just the numbers and the types of behaviors. You saw the earlier slides with 70% of our population being, you know, violent offenses. We really distilled out the incarcerated population through the JFI, where a lot of folks are being supervised in the field, who used to kind of do time in the facilities when I started. There was a little more of a ratio. Now we have pretty serious people that are incarcerated. So some of those behaviors, there's a demand on those beds. In a large facility, you might need more of those. But those are pretty full most of the time.
What type of beds are you talking?
Segregation beds.
Just segregation, you're not talking about like infirmary beds or mental health beds?
There's a demand on all of them for sure, but as I understood your question, you're leaning more towards segregation.
I was asking about all, but just take segregation. So of the segregation, not enough beds in the facility, you transfer somebody to the facility.
Yes, we absolutely do. And we maintain a running list of folks that, you know, unfortunately, sometimes there's like a waiting list for closed custody beds. So that's the status that we will, when we do our review of segregation every month, we make sure that we denote how many folks are in each facility and how long they've been on that waiting list, so that they're not in a segregated environment for an onerous amount of time, waiting to get into an actual true close custody program where you start to kind of tier yourself out and that in your way back.
So you do have a dynamic system, so it's not as if one facility didn't have enough beds and all of a sudden you just couldn't do that.
I think the needs outstretch some of our resources, but it is a dynamic system that's been set up in that manner. I mean, I think what we're calling our high security beds, you know, there's 68 system wide, but whether or not the 68 are evenly spread out where we need them most is not always the case. There's structural limitations.
We know we have booking cell limitations in places.
So
bed limitations. I've seen some that swell here and there over the years, but
geriatric, is there any bottleneck in the geriatric?
That's a good question. I would probably bounce to Josh on that to get you an accurate answer, but Springfield is, and I know we have some folks here who frequent Springfield a lot. There's a demand on that unit, and there's a sick population and an aging population. We absolutely have, you know, I would not be surprised to hear Josh say that there's a waiting list or we could use more folks.
You know, so I'm just looking for where the bottlenecks, where are the things that need urgent need for fixing.
On those sort of geriatric or medical or mental health beds, although part of that is that we triage who needs them and who needs them most. We certainly have seen an increase in that elderly population, and I know there was I think we did a press release a while ago we're working with the Department of Aging and Independent Living to hopefully open up some beds outside of the correctional system for some of those folks who maybe would be better served somewhere else. Those are in tight demand, but we're not, I don't think, over committed in that regard yet. But it is an area that we watch, and we always have to do a little bit of balancing in terms of making sure that we're figuring out who has those needs, who needs that most right now.
So I think it would be helpful for the committee to have a breakdown. Like you said, there's 68 across the system of closed custody beds. So it would be nice to know across the system, how many infirmary beds do we have? Sure. How many booking beds do we have? I think that would be helpful.
We prepared for you, Chair Emmett. So this is the breakdown. Admissions beds, we have 7 for females and 40 for males. Infirmary, our total capacity is 5 for females and 12 for males. We have 28 male geriatric beds for high acuity mental health, 8 for females and 10 for males. For mental health, I need to distinguish here. Mental health that has a need higher than general population but lower than that high acuity. We have 12 for females and 26 for males. We also have in St. Johnsbury, that what was formerly called the work camp building. That is 106 beds. It is only minimum custody. It's our only true minimum custody housing in the state for males. And so there are limitations in that regard. We have 2 units in Northwest that house individuals who are engaged in sex offender programming. We have 62 close custody beds, all for males, and for female, and we have high security. We have 24 for females and 68 for males. The female number definitely needs a little bit of discussion. That 24 high security beds is really more than we need for that institution. As everyone is aware, Chittenden was not designed for the population it houses. And I think the department's been pretty clear that it doesn't meet our needs or the needs of that population at this point in time. So we have to be flexible with how we use that space. So sometimes we'll use that for individuals who are close custody. Oh, I'm sorry. I had those numbers reversed on that chart. So 24 close custody beds and 7 high security for the women. But we don't have 24 women who are close custody. We just don't. So we will use that for other folks. A lot of the folks who come into our system are detoxing, have been actively using substances, and usually may benefit from a couple of days before they transition to regular population. A little bit more privacy and a little higher level of observation. So they might spend a little bit of time there before they go out to population.
One thing to point out, based on some of the questions, some of the pain points structurally, if you look at the line for Northern State Correctional Facility, that's our largest facility. You see that they have 402 general population beds. But as far as close custody options, they have 10, and they have 8 high security options. And with 402 general population beds, they 78%, 70%, something like that, of their folks are violent offenders, or have violent crimes. So there's a bottleneck there that maybe from a zoomed out perspective doesn't seem as intense, but I'm sure if you talk to our folks in Northern, they'd say it's pretty intense. So there's challenges that arise when you kind of drill into some of these numbers around the beds and the mission of each facility.
Wait a minute, Troy.
I just want to note for the committee, Josh mentioned earlier the growth in our geriatric population, which is considered 55 plus in the carceral system. That number in the last 20 years has increased by 300% in the Vermont system. So just to give you a sense again, these buildings were built for a different population than we're currently serving.
So Troy?
What are the factors or some of the factors that draw Vermont residents to want to stay out of state? And then how many of those factors could be easily recreated here in Vermont?
You want to know? Well, Josh has been there more than me. But I had the opportunity to go down there last year. And it was a fascinating all the way through. Because I didn't understand this either. I think this is a really big question. The cells are larger than what we offer, I think, in any of the facilities in Vermont. The living units themselves are larger, so the day rooms are bigger, there's a lot more space to move around, so you can kind of spread out a little. They allow PlayStations or other video gaming consoles that we don't allow in Vermont. I think it's the shuffle is part of the problem. In Vermont, we're constantly moving folks because we are very constrained by the physical infrastructure that we have. In Mississippi, we have 2 housing units in 1 building, so nobody's moving by and large. It was interesting. I asked. There were about 125 folks, maybe 130 when I was there, and we got them all together. And I asked, like, who wants to go back to Vermont? And it was like radio silence. And then we had these little small groups where I sat down with a few at a time so we could have more in-depth conversations. And the consistent theme was the only thing that's better in Vermont is the food, which you don't hear in the Vermont facilities if you go visit. The food is very good. So I think it's the other kind of primary reason is folks that we moved to Mississippi are serving usually very long sentences with no chance for release in the near term, and they're all sentenced. And so you have to remember, we have a unified system in Vermont, so we have detainees and sentenced individuals mixed together. And the folks who are detaining, they come in for a couple of days, they don't know people, or they, be a little rowdy, whatever. There's a different, I think, social compact that grows amongst a population who all know they're gonna be there for a long period of time. So I think everything is just a little calmer, quieter, just,
Stable.
Yeah.
Do they have their own cell or do they share a cell?
They share, I'm trying to remember now.
Majority of them have their own cell at the moment because we have 2 living units down there. And we've been able to keep those numbers down so low. Generally, the folks who have a cellmate at this point in time have a cellmate because they've requested to live with a specific individual. But the majority of our folks are in single cells. And I would just echo the commissioner that stability is one of the things I hear from folks most commonly when they're expressing their desire to go out of state or to stay there. Is they're around other individuals who are doing sentences, who are doing longer sentences, and they're not constantly exposed to that new person who came off the street who's a little out of control, who's dysregulated, and you're around a group of people where you have that different social construct because they're all doing a period of time.
So it's a sense of social stability.
Yep.
I will agree. I mean, Josh, I think mentioned it a little earlier, but every time I go into one of our facilities, one of our male facilities, I get asked if I can send them to them. Somebody will always come back.
It's kind of contrary to what we hear. We should bring folks back and they don't want to be down there and the families don't want them down there. Kind of contrary.
Usually you hear from the squeaky wheel. The squeaky wheel doesn't always represent the masses.
So I won't dwell on this slide because I think it speaks to itself. But we consistently over the course of the year have remained in that sort of 120 to 140 range, 120%, 130% of our population or available beds. And again, we have that 100 marked there for that pink line, but where we'd really like to see things is actually at 85, so a bit below that. So that's been pretty consistent throughout the year, and we are still, as a system, probably about 300 or so down from our pre-COVID numbers. So that is with our reduced headcount, we're still remaining above our general population beds.
About 125%.
About
correct?
that, yes. Yes, ma'am. So, a number of us have been working. Director Denton has certainly been involved in planning some proposals around the new facility for women. And I think one of the things that becomes shockingly clear to us in that is that the facilities that we have currently were not designed for how we want to use them, how we want to operate our system. And we certainly do a lot to work as best as we can around that structure, but that structure doesn't necessarily serve us. And I personally have a terror that 20 years down the road, someone will be cursing me for decisions we're making now around how we design future facilities because we don't meet their needs then. Sort of the same way we are worrying about those who design them. We have 6 facilities around the state. They're all fairly small. We do suffer some lack of economy of scale. We always have some beds offline for unit maintenance. We're always doing work in our institutions, and I know Commissioner Fitch has been in to discuss that, as have others. Sometimes that's work that we can do around or while we're still operating, but depending on what we're doing, we very often have to empty a unit. So when on that chart it shows that we have 997 beds, general population beds, but 947 available today. That's because we have a unit in Southern State that's closed due to an ongoing construction project down there. And that's our newest facility, but it is 20 years old now. So we're doing that work sort of constantly. I don't think we need to talk about flooding much in this building. I think you guys will have plenty of time to talk about that without correction. But we don't have capacity built into the system in case of an emergency where we might need to empty a unit suddenly. If there was some sort of structural damage or something that required, God forbid, a fire, that required that we empty a unit suddenly, we don't have a capacity to sort of shift that. We of course have emergency plans. We wouldn't be ill prepared to deal with that, but I don't think that we're built to manage it. One thing that's really become apparent in the last 10 years that wasn't a factor, or wasn't a factor we thought about when I started in the department, is the housing of gender diverse individuals. We have an increasing number of folks who identify as gender diverse, whether that's identifying as a gender other than what they were born, or identifying as something other than that sort of binary male and female. And our system really, like so much of society right now, is built around that binary. And so we have processes to work with that population, but you are trying to house folks in the most appropriate way in a system that really wasn't designed for them or with mind. When we have younger individuals, emerging adults in our system, we have both federal PREA standards and federal standards under the Juvenile Justice and Rehabilitation Act, or Ag Reform Act, my apologies, dictating how we must house those and how we keep them separated from the rest of the population, maintaining at certain points in time sight and sound separation, and of course just making sure that we're maintaining the safety of folks who really could be potentially vulnerable in our system, and we want to avoid any situation where someone leaves our system with more trauma than they walked in with. We did talk about those special populations, the special beds. One thing that we've been working on a lot over the last year has been the establishment of honors dorms. And we currently have one operating in Southern and one in Chittenden. And that's really a bit of a paradigm shift for Vermont. Those have not been without some bumps in the road, but have been largely successful. I was able to visit the one in Springfield about 2 weeks ago and talk with the gentleman there about how well that's working. And a couple of us went up to the Maine State Prison a month or two ago, where they've taken that concept and they've worked with it for a number of years. And they have a really nice honors unit that works very well for them. So that's been, I think, a really nice step forward for us. And I know that the gentleman I spoke to in Southern were very happy with that, and hoping that that's something we could continue. And then, of course, we've spoken a number of times about just mixing of populations, the challenges of being a combined system. I think in an ideal world, you would separate those populations, and given the small size of our system, and what would be a need to duplicate services for each of those individual populations, that's simply not practical. And to pick one, very easy example, we may have a priest come in to do Catholic services. If I wanted to maintain those populations separately, I might need to see if that individual could come in 3 different times to do those Catholic services, for that sentence population, for that detained population, for that federal population. And if you can imagine dividing up all our services and triplicating them to meet each of those needs, it simply wouldn't be an efficient use of our beds or our resources.
So I hope that gives the committee some background in terms of our beds, and that feeds into the discussion of our out-of-state population and bringing folks back. And I think part of what's also interesting is the buildings are limiting what can be done. You got concrete walls. So it's not eating some are on a small piece of property. And then we also have to balance what size do we want our large facilities to be. Because folks, you know, we've got Newport that's over 400, we've got Springfield that's about 350, we have St. Albans is around 290 or thereabouts. And then you've got a Chittenden facility in the St. Johnsbury and the Marble Valley, which are in the low hundreds for that. Anytime you start talking about a larger facility, closing what you have and start with a larger facility, people just get real concerned. That's changing the dynamics of how the system is run within that facility, but our buildings are limiting a lot of what we can do. It's really, if you've got a close custody wing, like you do in St. Albans, it's a wing with a closed door, locked door. At the entrance of that wing, you go in that wing and you may have 5 cells on each side or 6 cells on each side, and they're all locked. And it's just got that little hallway. That's what we got in some of the facilities. You're not going to put general population folks in there.
And if I may, Madam Chair, that area around restrictive and high security housing is one of the areas we feel that most. Because we've really, corrections across the country, but certainly here in Vermont has done a lot of work in the last 5 to 7 years around restrictive housing. And there's a strong desire to deliver more services to those populations. And the physical infrastructure simply wasn't designed with that in mind. So when you talk about that hallway, that's now physically secure for those folks who may be more dangerous, but wasn't built with the idea of more communal recreation or communal eating or delivery of groups and services. So not that we don't work to do those things, but that we're working against our own buildings to do so, not in concert with them. And I know Vermont is not alone in facing that challenge, but as we've continued to both try and reduce the amount of folks who are in restrictive housing, but increase what's available to them, that infrastructure really does pose some challenges for us on a day-to-day basis in doing that.
And then you throw in the geriatric population that have mobility issues. And in Newport and Springfield, you've got levels of cells with stairs to go up. So then you're limiting that piece. So this is something we can do a deeper dive in if people are interested, but at least I wanted to lay the foundation out there as a reminder for some folks, and as new information for some folks in terms of our beds. In our system, we have probably about 700 beds that are special housing beds, one way or another, out of the system. We're done, Ben. You can come in. Yeah. So I want to tie up. We're done. We may have you folks back. I want to thank you all for coming in. We have to be on the floor at 3 o'clock. So we need to go off of YouTube. I believe we're done for the day. As we're on the floor, we may have a long debate on the floor. But if we, by any chance, have a little bit of time after the floor and people want to come back and process this and kind of figure out where we want to go for